Hello, my name is Douglas Gabriel, and this is the third installment in a tribute to Ralph Marinelli, the man who discovered, or who proved, excuse me, that the heart is not a pump. I did one myself, a little audio presentation, and then I was fortunate enough to have the man who worked right alongside Ralph Marinelli to make this incredible discovery, John Barnwell, who just did an audio with us. And now I had promised in the first audio that I would give some esoteric background to what we first started with in the fifth chamber group that we handed over to Ralph as our studies about what the human heart really is. So to address the question esoterically, or through occult anatomy, or esoteric physiology, whatever you want to call it, about the human heart, well, basically it's too staggering of a quest, as John called it. It's a question, it's an open-ended question. So all I can say here today is to give some indications, as John was giving indications in relationship to the fact that the heart, to understand the heart literally is the quest of the Holy Grail. Now, I can give some indications from Rudolf Steiner, share those. I can share indications from spiritual esoteric paths. We also are making reference even to things that are in the Gospel of Sophia, especially the second volume where great secrets are revealed about this. I'll be sharing some of those here today to give you an idea of what might be possible. We don't really know. And so as we talk about the heart, we have to put it into a bigger perspective, into the cosmology of what a human being is. Because as John pointed out, in the human heart is where we find our consciousness, our ego. Rudolf Steiner said it was literally in the warmth of the blood, but focused in the heart. So the heart and blood circulation, those are one thing, really, when it comes down to it. So we're going to talk about that today, but at first I have to give an apology that no one can do this topic justice. So there's nothing that I can say or do that would give you an understanding of what it took for Ralph Marinelli and John Barnwell to actually discover a very key aspect of the human heart. And as they did, they uncovered many, many aspects, also spiritual aspects. John didn't get into what we call, flighty, imaginative, speculative ideas about the heart and what it could be, but I like to do that myself. So let's put this thing in perspective. First off, we have to understand that we are a being that really we are not bound by time. In our head, we have the past. In our heart, we have the present. And in our metabolic system, we have the future. And the pole of the head is cold, and the pole of the metabolic system is hot. So as John was talking about the kidneys and the heart, again, that polarity between hot and cold happens between certain paired organs. But in this case, we're talking just in big general pictures. So in the West, we believe that our consciousness is in the head. And that's because we have materialistic thinking given to us through our secular mythology called science, which no one ever points out that it changes every day, and yet they don't change the textbooks. So what science knows and what science applies are two different things. And as we pointed out, both John and myself previously, science can observe something for hundreds of years and never really notice what it was that they were observing, not really see it for what it is. For example, just a quick example, what is electricity? Science works with it. It runs all of our devices. It runs our life. But what is it? There's actually no theory for many of these things. Electricity is invisible. It's a force that is inexplicable. They know how to create it, but they do not know how to define it. And the same would be true with the human heart. So, as the human heart, in the first 2 months of embryological development, replicates the entire development of all of the animals up to the human, that gives us a picture that the heart is in the present, but it has the past. So the heart is connected to the head. So the head being the past and being cold, and the present, the heart, being the source of warmth in the body, also uses the metabolic warmth, a different type of warmth, to feed the whole system. But it's really once the metabolic system does everything that it does with nutrition, it hands over to the heart and to the blood, spreading that nutrition to every cell in the body. So what the heart does, it stands between these two poles. And if you don't know that, then you can't really see the central place of the heart. But the heart is much more, much more than just that in that picture. It is far, far, far beyond that. The heart is the center of all consciousness. In the West, we think it's in the head because we're cold, materialistic thinkers. In the East, they all say that it is in the heart. And sometimes in Europe and other places, they'll say that consciousness is in what you do. And they really don't give so much credence to thinking nor to feeling, because they believe that feeling resides in the heart. But feeling is only one part of what the heart does, one very small part of what the heart does. And so the metabolic system is the future. And you can see that in the fact that you eat food, but immediately it isn't the energy that you use. It takes a long time. And then in the future, you get that energy after it goes through a process that is really quite complicated to bring it into a substance like human sugar, glucose, attached with also oxygen, attached with iron, delivering that to every single cell in the body, and then bringing back CO2 to the heart. Well, this process of respiration that creates warmth in the body is not understood at all. And so there are parts of this process that literally are the past in the neurological functions of the heart, and parts that are the future in the metabolic processes of the heart. So that's a general overview of what you need to see to begin with. But once the human heart, which has in it our consciousness, receives the higher, basically what in the East they call the pink drop, the pink eternal drop in the heart. And the heart is often seen as a well where you can find wisdom and life and refreshment. And it's like the well that comes up in the Garden of New Jerusalem that spreads out to the four corners. So there's four chambers in the heart, at least we'll talk about now, four chambers in the heart, and this river that's flowing in and out, kind of like the picture, this New Jerusalem. And when you look at the picture of New Jerusalem, it's described as a city four square. It's actually a cube. And that cube has all these precious metals and elements in it, but inside of it is this life. And there's two trees there. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is still there, and the tree of life is also there. But out of the tree of life comes this nourishment from this image. Well, those images are found whether you go to Mount Meru or the beliefs of ancient India, and look at it through that perspective, or the Jade Palace of the Emperor in the West, if you want to go with the Chinese version. But no matter what version you go with, Shambhala or whatever, it basically describes the same thing. It's describing the human heart. And it's the pinnacle. Now that throws us off. We think the human heart should be like the head. The head's the highest. The head is the past, and the head is the starry sky. It's the whole zodiac. It's a picture of the past in its most perfect form. The most perfect form of the human being is the head. In the future, your whole body will be round like the head, according to Rudolf Steiner and many other people who predict what the future will be like. So when we look at the heart, it has evolved and shown us the evolution all the way up to what we are. But what people don't realize is inside of the heart is who we will be. So there are four chambers to the heart now. But Rudolf Steiner and esoteric philosophers and initiates have pointed out that there are more than four chambers to the heart. There are 7 chambers to the heart. And the mysteries of understanding the 7 chambers of the heart have to do with the unfolding of the present going into the future. So the 4 that we see now, the 4 chambers that we see now, those represent the past. And they represent what human evolution has brought to this point. But the 5th chamber of the heart, the 6th and the 7th chamber of the heart have to do with the future. Rudolf Steiner said, through references that he gave, as John Barnwell pointed out, with Aaron Fried Pfeiffer's work on the human heart, as well as Rudolf Steiner's lecture, The Human Heart, which is a principal lecture to understand what Rudolf Steiner says the heart is. And I made a commitment to my teacher, Werner Glass, years ago, that as a teacher trainer, I would make sure that every single person training to become a Waldorf teacher had a copy of Rudolf Steiner's lecture, The Human Heart. Because if you read it, it will change the way that you really look at the human being. And you will see that the human being is basically what we'd call in modern terms, a holographic image of the universe. And that is found in the human heart. Because the human heart reflects the past and also reflects the future. And so you can see that developing the fifth, sixth, and seventh chamber of the hearts could have to do with the future. Well, John Barnwell, myself, Brian Lynch, Robert Thibodeau, Rick Knutson, and many others, Frank Hall and Jim Wetmore, and a whole group of people. We studied together for years, and one of the things we studied was the human heart. And so what I'm going to tell you comes from kind of the work of the whole group. As far as I can remember, the type of spiritual directions that we had come up with, which we couldn't really do much with until Ralph brought his engineering in and was able to show that the most basic premise that Rudolf Steiner gave about the heart could be proven, and demonstrate that modern science had a very strange view of the heart, very materialistic view of the heart. So, the human heart at this point can be defined by Rudolf Steiner as the following. It's a space inside of you, in your heart, where there is a forward and a backward, a left, a right, and an up and a down. And inside of those directions is where your ego is, your consciousness. Now, if you realize that those directions create a cube, if you're inside of it, then one could say that the human heart is a cube. But some people don't like to hear that. And it's going to change in the future. It's going to metamorphose into a dodecahedron. Now, let me describe that from the inside of the cube. The inside of the cube, if you were in the middle of it and you were looking out, you'd see 6 surfaces. In front of you, in back of you, to the left, right, up, and down. And you'd know that those realms, as far as you could reach with your hand or as far as you could get up and move, those are your realms. But you got to understand, the human being can get up and get on a plane and go somewhere. So how big is the cube that your ego exists in? It's as big as your consciousness. So the cube has to be something that can grow very large and grow very small. Now, Rudolf Steiner gave a description of the human heart, and he said that if one were to take the human consciousness like the mystics used to take their consciousness and dive inside of their being, no matter how hard they dived inside to find out who they were and what is that ego, that I consciousness, that consciousness that's inside of them, and is it the same thing as God? They were looking for God, and they looked inside, and no matter how hard they penetrated inside their soul and went down deep, what did they find? A rock-hard place that they'd hit and could go no further. That's that cube. It's like a rock-hard cube because basically you can't extinguish your own I. You cannot extinguish your ego. You see, this is a powerful, powerful thought. That's the going to the point. And then if you cannot penetrate this, it's like a rock. He called it an inviolable space, a space that cannot be violated, a space that is so pristine and pure that nothing of the physical world has ever entered it. It's an eternal space. It's the place that carries your reincarnating consciousness. But remember, as we said, that cube can expand to the size of the universe. There are 200 billion galaxies. My mind just expanded to hold all of them. Then my consciousness is that big. That cube expanded that big. So don't get locked into this as a cube that is like the Kaaba of the Muslims, or that it's a physical substance. It's not. It is basically the Holy Grail. It is this Rudolf Steiner even creates pictures of it in the seals of the apocalypse, and he shows that consciousness comes from trying to penetrate into those 6 sides of the cube, but you can't. But you are inside. So it can expand, it can contract, but you can't destroy it. You cannot annihilate it. You do not have the power to extinguish it. So he called it a rock, but he also said it was a cube, and he defined it as the spaces I just described. Now that's one thing, and it's a very frustrating thing, he said, to penetrate into the heart and just meet solid resistance. He said you can go the other direction, and that's what scientists and philosophers do. They go the other direction. And what did they run into? Well, no matter what time period they were, whatever the scientist lived in, it didn't matter. Whatever their concept was, I just mentioned 200 billion galaxies. They didn't have those concepts back then, but they had other concepts very similar, spiritual, insightful concepts, because they were clairvoyant in the ancient times. They could understand these things. But when you go back to modern scientists, starting with the Greeks, and you come forward, basically, when the Greek philosopher, let's just say, went out into the cosmic space beyond what they might even imagine as our own solar system, the planets that move about us, the moving stars, as they called them, into the realm of the stars. What would happen if you keep going out there? Same thing kind of happens today. When you lie down, you look at the stars, and you go and you can see the Milky Way, and you go out there and you go, whoa, I'm getting a little dizzy here. There's no ground underneath my feet. And as I keep expanding out, and now I want to experience the entire sphere of the zodiacal influence of the stars, you come to a space of nothingness, of the emptiness of space once you go beyond that. And he says you meet ultimate fear. And this fear will drive you back into the human body. So you can take consciousness outward from the heart to as large as your particular version of the universe is, and you can take consciousness into the heart as strong as you have mystical force to go in to penetrate that. One is like a cave, and the other one, when you get out there, is like a cave. Now, what's really very peculiar is that in some previous mythologies, beliefs, ideas, colloquialisms, all the beliefs of the ancient times, there are many of them that believe that the space that we live in is a cube, which is odd. And there's many, many references to the cube, and some people worship the cube and all these different things. And you go, okay, well, that makes some sense. But also, when you look at what modern science now tells us is the shape of the universe, there are a variety of versions of it because they use different types of machines to read what they consider to be whether the gamma wave version or the X-wave version or the optical version or of the universe. There are 7 different forms they use to span out radio frequencies. But when they merged them all together not too long ago, they said that, well, first off, the universe they conceived to be like a triangle, a corrugated triangle with the cluster of stars in the middle, the most concentrated. Then they noticed that it was bigger than that, and it looked somewhat like the outline of a human body. Still flat, though. And then they thought it looked like a trumpet, but a trumpet that did something very, very odd. That which was on the inside of the trumpet as it went out, when it reached the outer lip of the trumpet, turned back in on the outside and went back to where the mouthpiece of the trumpet is, and then it went into the mouthpiece and came out the inside of the trumpet, and it kept doing this. So it's like you could even say like I don't know, a Mobius curve or a torus field, a toroidal field that looks like a donut. So the inside becomes the outside becomes the inside. Then they finally put it all together, and one of the most recent versions is the universe is the shape of a dodecahedron. That's a 12-sided solid, a platonic solid, that has 5 pentagons, all connected together with 60 points and 12 surfaces. So if you were standing in the inside of the cube and you looked out, you'd see 6 surfaces. But if you're standing in the inside of a dodecahedron and you look out, you see 12. Rudolf Steiner said the human heart was growing from this perception of what would be called a cube that expands and contracts to a dodecahedron. that also expands to its ultimate outer peripheral limit and then collapses back to the very middle, to the point at the inside of that platonic solid. Now, what does that sound like? Something that expands really big and then contracts, and expands really big and then contracts. That is the human heart. Now, on a cosmic level, it goes very slowly, at least it appears to. And we could go into that in great detail. But Rudolf Steiner said everything in the universe is found in the human body. So the human heart, being the center of consciousness, would be a perfect replica of the entire universe. No matter what shape you conceive it to be, it doesn't really matter. Because he said anytime you go beyond our own solar system, human thoughts do not apply. You cannot really conceive of anything beyond our solar system. And we're now finding out that the way we even conceive our solar system is incorrect, and it is correct, and it moves in the fashion that Rudolf Steiner says it did in his lectures called the astronomy course. He was correct. And now the exact motions created by computers, because scientists weren't even able to imagine the exact motion of our solar system, when you look at them, they're beautiful. It looks like DNA. It looks like it looks like something creating DNA, because the sun moves towards Vega and it pulls all of the planets behind them with magnetic cords. Those magnetic cords are also electric, and you think that they'd collide with the other planets, but what Rudolf Steiner said was, it is not an ellipse that the planets move on. It's not like on a plate. They always imagine it like a plate, like the plate of a galaxy. He says that's not what's happening at all. The inside planets, Mercury, Venus, and the Earth and its moon, are in one motion, which is a figure eight, a limnoscate, they call it, a figure eight. And the outer planets are going around both the sun and the inner planets in a bigger figure eight, so they're being pulled behind it. And that's the reason that scientists could never mathematically calculate that there could be, as the ancients said, and as Rudolf Steiner said, a magnetic cord that goes from the sun to each of the planets. Well, they've now demonstrated it's true, and they now are mapping out these magnetic cords that look almost like, oh, it's just amazing to look them up. It's the same exact pattern that the human brain makes when it creates thoughts about higher spiritual divine concepts, which connect the entire brain, the front, the middle, and the back. And those are the same kind of patterns that are happening on the Earth as its magnetic response to the sun. But this cord goes all the way to the sun. So once you understand that your heart is the sun, and that your liver is Jupiter, and that your kidneys are Venus, and that your gallbladder is Mars, and what have I left out? Anyway, the sun with the 6 planets rotating around it is your heart and the 6 organs underneath your rib cage. And that's one set in the metabolic system, but the sun stands in between, in the lower metabolic system. So when we're talking about the outer planets, we're talking about the lower metabolic system. When we're talking about the inner planets, we're talking about the upper part of the body, from the heart to the head. So everything in the universe is found in the human body. So when you start to find these analogies, these correspondences, these analogs, you can then start to really make true connections. Because when scientists realize that the planets don't move the way that they always thought they did, because computer-generated images showed them they were wrong from their own observations, they did not see it. And now that they were shown by a computer, oh, now they all see it and act like they always knew it, because that's what scientists do, because otherwise they'd have to say that they don't know what they're talking about. And we know that they're omniscient. So what we really have is a complicated form of cords and a tube that the sun is making, and the planets are touching on the outer perimeter of that tube exactly in the same type of rhythmic fashion that DNA is formed. And so what we're seeing is kind of a cosmic DNA, but that cord that comes to us has 5 parts. There's 1 in the middle and 4 on the outside of the cords that are the magnetic cords connecting us to the sun. And this has just been discovered in the last few years. So what I'm telling you is shocking, but science has now confirmed so much of what Rudolf Steiner said. So So what is going on there is the chords of the heart, the verticordia, the spinning of the cordia, the heart. Cordia means heart. The heart is a bunch of chords. And when you unravel it, and it just unravels, it looks like intestines. But when you put it together, it's like a cloak around a vial, and the vial, it has turned into a figure eight. And then the figure eight goes out of the heart. But it comes in, it wraps around, it goes through the apex, it comes back, it makes a figure eight, it goes in and out of the lungs, and then it goes out again. So what you have is you're going into a triple vortex, and the very cords, the very fibers of the heart, which are filled with nerves, and people don't understand that. The heart is fantastically bioelectric. It's also fantastically biomagnetic. And so in these cords, just like the cords, the magnetic cords from the sun, and when you see the cords of magnetism on the earth that they're now able to take pictures of, it looks like the cords of the heart. But the heart has basically been wrapped up and turned into what we'd call like a Mobius curve. What comes inside is outside, outside, inside. But it's a magical thing, and it's all centered around the apex. And the apex is where that cube is, because the apex never changes. And the apex has running through it an axis of the heart, which replicates the axis of the earth, usually around an average of 23.5 degrees on a tilt. And if the heart starts to get ill and you start to get congestive heart failure, your heart starts to swell, and the way I would call it the pala of Sophia is what I would call it, that the outer wrapping of the heart, wrapping the inner part of the heart, is really, it's like a shroud that's wrapping around it to keep it warm, because the fire that is happening in the heart, coming in between the dynamic interaction of the lung and the heart, is a very, very, very special place. But in that apex is that phenomena of our experience of a cube, up, down, right, left, forward, backward, standing in relationship to the spin of the earth, which is, of course, in our experience, the experience of the seasons, depending upon where you live on the earth. And so the heart is a direct replica, not only of what's going on in the earth, but what's going on in the universe. And it is very clearly now been demonstrated that 7.83, what is called the Schumann resonance wave, that wave goes throughout the entire universe. That wave can penetrate solid steel, metal. It goes through the earth. It's a frequency that's found everywhere where there's spinning globes, because that creates frequencies, that creates sound, and that's the sound ether. We won't go a lot into the ethers because I've done so much on that in other places, and there's a new book out I've done now called The Eternal Ethers that explain it in great detail. But with the heart, you have not only the past in a cube, you have the future in a dodecahedron. Rudolf Steiner said, our heart will become a dodecahedron. We'll become beings who actually look out and experience the world in all directions as a manifestation of 12. So it's not just a zodiac on a plane, on an ecliptic of 12. That's our experience now. That's the experience of the cube, standing upright with our axis. In the future, no, we won't have that axis. We'll go off the earth. We'll live in the atmosphere. We'll have to be completely taking in cosmic nutrition from all directions, from all 12 directions. And he describes this with the 12 senses of what the human being will become. And so the heart tells what the future is. Now, I know that sounds a bit out there, but this is what is simply the conclusion of John Barnwell would call connecting the dots. Now, sometimes you don't want to connect the dots because you really make a huge mistake. So I'm just saying these are thoughts for meditation, because no one can really understand this, because the human mind can't understand it. We went over that. Not even in the solar system can we understand it, let alone the galaxy. But let's now remember, all galaxies they now know, they go between either a supermassive black hole or what is called a galactic jet, an ion jet, a galactic ion jet. Supermassive black hole is it draws everything in and eats up all the suns, and they go, we don't know where. And then over long periods of time, you see this in the age of different galaxies. And then it goes between those extremes, and then at the other end of the extreme, they have an ion jet that's bigger and longer than the whole galaxy, has more energy in it than the galaxy, and is spinning out hundreds of billions of stars. Okay, we were told that doesn't happen. We were told the Big Bang. No. The big ion jet. That's what creates stars in the galaxy. But they go between being sucked up and going somewhere, we don't know, we can speculate, and then coming back, and then later all kinds of stars are created, okay? So we go in between the extremes of this kind of male-female thing, the ion jet being the female and the male being this black, supermassive black hole. Well, that is exactly what happens in the heart, isn't it? And isn't that what they say happened in the partial, pathetic version of their Big Bang, that everything's contracted? Well, how did it get contracted? The whole universe is so contracted it fits in the palm of your hand, is what the Big Bang says. And then they're going to tell you what happened fractions of a second after it exploded and became 200 billion galaxies. Okay, that's complete nonsense. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. There's an organic movement, as we see in the galaxies, between this kind of disappearance into nothingness and then creation out of nothingness through an ion jet. Science doesn't want to address these things. Look up any of these things I'm saying. This is the new science that is ignored by everyone. But that's what the human heart is. And how does the ion jet work? It's two interpenetrated vortices that are spinning out in both directions, one a mirror to the other, literally star mass and stars and star substance to create stars. But then they flow into then the galactic, what we'd call the plane of the galactic spiral. But really, what we're talking about there is creation out of nothingness, and then creation going into nothingness, right? Creation going to nothingness, black holes, creation out of nothingness, ion jets. Well, that's what we see really in the world out there when we look out there, but we can't understand that. Matter of fact, you trying to understand that concept, you're going to call me a liar, you're going to look it up, and you're going to take your breath away. But that's what's going on in the human heart. The human heart is evolving into literally being a zodiac of its own, and all of that happening within your own heart once you evolve up the ladder of the hierarchy. This is, in the end, Rudolf Steiner points out that when you attain your Atman vehicle, which is called the spirit man, which should be changed to spirit human, which is the third of your three spiritual vehicles, the highest of your nine, what you would call the constitution of the human being, the highest level, the highest manifestation is you become a zodiac. You become everything that we see when we look out in all directions into the stars. We are that. But don't get dismayed. You may think that's a big job. It's not really, because in your brain are 200 billion neurons that are connected by synapses. And so you have replicated in your brain the same thing going on in the entire zodiac. In your heart, you have the fact that we as a conscious being are evolving through different stages in our physical body where our heart is changing, our body's changing, the vestigial organs are being left behind. We're taking more control of our bodily functions consciously, and this is how we become conscious. We become conscious of those organs in our body, starting with the heart, and as we do become conscious of them, then the beings who have worked so hard to create them, working in consonance and in resonance with the planetary spheres, they are thankful, because as we take this over, then we are the masters of this body. This body that we have is a perfect replica of the universe, but not at this moment. Humans are locked in time. We believe in time because we're down in physical dimension, 3D. But really, we're beings of time. Our heart, because of its beating in resonance with the entire universe, and also responding to the planets and the sun in our own solar system in relationship to what the organs are telling the sun, that is going into the future and changing our physical body so we will become a sphere, a globe in the future. Steiner called it a liquid diamond, a flowing liquid diamond, which is rarefied carbon. So now let's go into the fact that if you start at your heart and you go down, you become an animal. Right? That's where your desires for food are, where your anger is, where all the problems in your organs, your anger, your hatred, your fear, your lust, your greed, your, yuck, your pride, your envy. That's all below your heart. Now, if you let that come up into your heart, that's who you become. But we're supposed to have already worked through that according to Rudolf Steiner. So the heart is the midpoint where our consciousness starts, but it doesn't start by going down into that stuff. It starts by getting the energy coming from your metabolic system, what we would call cold fission energy, or the destruction of matter and the reconstruction of it. In other words, really taking matter and working with matter until it becomes something we can use, and then it brings it to the heart. The heart puts that onto the blood, along with perception, nourishment, and this interaction with really the spirit through oxygen, with breathing in and out. And then the heart responds and sends that out everywhere in the body as nourishment to keep the metabolic system going. But the heart is not that. The heart's not the past. The heart's not fission. The heart is fusion, transforming physical matter into spiritual matter. So when you start on the path of consciousness, you start in the heart. You don't start in your second chakra, your sex chakra. And you should have your foundation chakra, the way that you live, your art of life together, or you're really not going to develop your consciousness. And it shouldn't start in what your heredity has given you, the chakra below your heart. And it shouldn't start in your stomach and your desires and you shouldn't have weak energy, or you won't have energy for higher thinking. You need higher thinking. Higher thinking is more strenuous, according to Rudolf Steiner, than digging ditches. So we're going to go into higher thinking. You start at the heart, and you go up to the throat, and then to the forehead, or the brow, what's called the brow, and then you go to the crown. And you can call them chakras, you can call them nerve ganglia, you can call them endocrine glands. They're all connected, and all ancient yogas and all ancient Hindu Vedanta texts and all describe these things in great detail. But they've been transformed in the modern time, as I say, as Rudolf Steiner says. Our organs are transformed. So we now have a frontal spinal column. We don't just have the human-animal spinal column going up to our hind brain, the reptilian brain, and just telling us, whether we can walk, talk, move about in the world and master the six planes of a cube: forward, backward, up, down, left, right. That's what your spine does. Goes up to the reptilian brain. He calls that the cerebellum is it's actually called the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because the normal spine tells us what is right and wrong. Really, it does. And it does it and gives us twin organs, a left and a right, so that we can see both, and then we have to decide ourselves. So that's what that does. In the front, there's a spiritual frontal spinal column starting from the heart. And when you rarefy carbon and you take it up through those centers, and then you rarefy oxygen and nitrogen, well, you start with carbon and you rarefy carbon through holding back carbon and creating a higher fire, a hotter fire, a plasmic fire in the heart, and it goes up into the higher, what we would call chakras, or the nerve centers, going up into the brain. And that's been proven now through a place called the Heart Mind Institute. They've shown that if the heart is not in coherence with the brain, it doesn't work as well. Same thing with the brain. If the brain is not in coherence, literally, we're talking about resonant electronic also coherence. We're talking about bioelectrical coherence. And once that's achieved, you rarefy the elements of oxygen and nitrogen and hydrogen. And when you do, you raise that carbon up until it becomes carbon. Rudolf Steiner pointed out, it becomes calcium carbonate, and it gets deposited in your pineal gland. And then the coherence between your heart and that special place in the apex, that I hesitate to call it a cube. Let's call it, Steiner, I think it was referred to as the rock upon which my church is built. It's the rock, it's your consciousness. So let's just call it the crystal. Let's call it the crystal cube in the heart. That would be a nicer image. So if you go from the crystal cube in the heart to the calcium carbonate in the pineal gland, you can have coherence. And that is demonstrated very clearly because, and Steiner goes into great detail about it, he calls it the earthly and cosmic nutrition stream. That starts with the heart. You see, without the heart, you don't even start consciousness. If you're in your head, cold thinking, that is not consciousness. That is a automaton response to the outer world. It's just simply stimulus and response. But when you start with the heart and the warmth of the heart, and you use that to penetrate your thoughts, and then coherence is created, and literally a figure eight is created through your head, through your throat to your heart and back up, much like the figure eight found in the heart itself, much like the figure eight found in the outer planets and in the inner planets. That figure eight, the symbol of eternity, if you just separate the middle, it becomes a Mobius curve. If on that figure eight you go from inside to outside, which is exactly what's happening. You go from outer perception through what comes in through the blood, and that is transformed through the mineral substance in your body through blood. And if the carbon can become hot enough in a plasmic way in the heart, which is a plasma generator, by the way, and by the way, there's a plasma generator in the head and a plasma generator also in your metabolic system. So as the plasmic energy rises up from your heart and it is transformed, it can become then this attachment to, this connection to the coherence with the brain, and then really the earthly and cosmic nutrition stream can start. We feed the gods feed us. We have to feed them first. They're not going to give us spiritual substance if we haven't created an empty space in our heart to hold it. Same thing with blue blood returning to the heart. The first thing that happens when it enters is there's a spark, a bioelectrical spark at the top where it enters the heart there, and it spreads that spark to other receptors below it, and it sends out bioelectrical shocks through the heart. And that's what gives the signal to the heart to expand and contract. It's bioelectrical. The ancients always said, if you can imagine that a person, depending upon their morality, would depend upon how big this flame next to the heart is. It's as big as a thumb for most people. So it's in between the lung and the heart. So it's really at that spot where the blue blood is returning to the body, and it's beginning to sense what it is that the lung is bringing as oxygen. And it's almost a longing, and it's this longing between kind of sucking, which would be the blue blood dark male, and this spark, which is like an ion jet female, that this heart is then triggered to expand and contract as we know it. So they have always said in the past that the ancient yogis could extinguish that, and they could determine their moment of death, and at the moment of their death they would extinguish that flame as big as their thumb next to their heart. Some people have noticed, doctors working on hearts, that there have been that spot on the heart is hot, very, very hot. When someone is sick and their heart is arrhythmic, it shoots off too much bioelectric energy and becomes so hot that it can harm someone, harm their heart. So we look at the heart as this expansion and contraction, but the expansion and contraction is what our own consciousness does. Same thing with the lungs. We expand, we contract. We live in a symbiotic relationship between oxygen and carbon dioxide with the plant world. And that's the same thing that we do with the entire cosmos. We are in a cosmic consciousness, inhalation, exhalation of consciousness in the human heart. And when we can take it from the heart and take it all the way up to the pineal gland and create a new frontal spinal column, as Rudolf Steiner called it, and so did Blavatsky. When you create this etheric frontal spinal column, and you create refined ethers, and you refine substances, physical substances, which are really also part of the physical constitution of the human body, and you refine them, then they actually create consciousness. And the way they do that is, when you create if you take a mineral substance and you put it into a flame, it fires up and becomes a plasma. If you take salt and you put it into flame, it'll flash. That flash of white is plasma. Normally they assume plasma's hot, but there are cold plasmas. And in the human heart, that electrical exchange that I was talking about in the human heart also happens in the human brain, also happens in just below your belly button in your metabolic system. That is a plasmic reaction because you have the gas in blood, and that's what it takes for a plasma. You have a gas which is impregnated with metals and minerals, and those are the minerals I mentioned, as well as iron and manganese for women, magnesium and others, substances that are metals. You put it into a gas and you run it across an electrical magnetic field. And there's a huge magnetic field around the heart, especially at these bioelectrical stimulation points. And at those points, what is happening is the returning blue blood is so filled with substance, carbon dioxide included, and also returning metals and minerals, that they become a flashpoint for the heart to become a plasma. And that gas of the blood then becomes fueled by the mineral substance in the blood and makes the heart even hotter. That's where we get the heat from the oxygen. Oxygen, as we breathe the air, it's not hot. How did we get hot? How did we get the flame in our body? We are a cold burning flame, according to alchemy, and we are a flame, just as they consider the sun to be a flame, as they considered all, actually, wandering stars to be flames too, but colder flames, but all distant stars they considered to be altars with flames on them. So it's all flames. It's all about what rate you're going to burn. And if your heart starts to get out of its proper relationship to the axis of the earth, or if it starts to unravel, or if it doesn't have the exact cross point over the apex of the figure 8, the Mobius curve, which turns substance into spirit, that very, what is called catabolized carbon. In other words, refined ionic carbon and refined ionic oxygen, refined ionic nitrogen and hydrogen, also sulfur and also phosphorus. Those are all transformed and they become the metal mineral content that is needed for deposits in the human brain so that your brain can literally begin to shine like the stars and you can start fires up in the brain also. And this can be explained quite thoroughly too, and it is explained in the second volume of the Gospel of Sophia. So that's what I wanted to say today, was to explain to you what we were working with as the fifth chamber. The fifth chamber is the secret of our times, and that has been revealed. And it was not through Ralph's work, but he discovered this, that there is a sheath around the heart. And without that, the heart wouldn't work. And they found, as soon as you operate on someone, that from that point on, when the sheath isn't there, it's kind of like breaking the amniotic fluid or the amniotic sac. It's a very bad thing to do. You need that sac around the heart. They never thought that sac meant anything. That's the fifth chamber. So what is the fifth chamber? It's when your friends surround you and you have a good conversation about the spirit so that an angel comes in. The human heart is a grail. It's a smithy. It's a forge. It's a hearth. In the old time, the same derivative words were all the same for heaven, mother, hearth, heart, ear, earth. Those were all the same word. So the heart is our mother. The heart is our hearth. It is where the fire is. And when you can stoke up that fire with really higher thinking, higher feeling, higher willing, what Rudolf Steiner calls imagination, inspiration, intuition, that is the substance that fuels, that stokes that fire. And then you must go in there, and just like with the Sampo of the Norse myth of the Kalevala, you must be the smithy, and again, 4 times over, you must throw that substance back in the fire and form it into a new substance. And then the 4th time, that is the Sampo. That is the glow that you have around you that an angel would have, or that a saint would have, called a halo. And that halo is where? It's in between the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, where also a plasmic reaction happens, which is described again in the Gospel of Sophia. Also in the metabolic system, we've described that. So in the human body, you have astounding thing happen. You think you're not the sun? Your heart is the sun. Fusion reaction. You are changing one substance into another in the heart. You think you aren't the inner fires of the earth, that molten core of the earth? Wrong. That's your metabolic system. You're doing it all the time. If you think you can look out in the stars and that's more than you can comprehend, incorrect. It's in your brain. And when you get all 3 working together, that's called intuition. And Rudolf Steiner said intuition starts in the heart. You start with the brain, but you got to get a sword. You got to get your thinking, and you got to go down to the heart and pierce the heart. And when the heart starts to bleed, a substance rises up. And in that rising substance, you can ride your consciousness up into the spiritual world, feed them your higher thinking, feeling, and willing, and then immediately through the process of happened in the brain I just mentioned, in that crucible of the brain where Steiner said also the Grail Castle exists there at the pineal gland sitting on top of the corpus quadragemini, and then across the crucible of the third ventricle all the way to the pituitary gland. He said that is the path of the Grail. And that is where the Grail glows in the head of every person. That's the halo. That's the aurora borealis. That's our personal aurora borealis. And when that happens, that's when the resonance comes, and your crown chakra, or your whole head, this starry thing that happens in your brain, in your cerebral cortex, not the reptilian brain, not the midbrain, but your cerebral cortex becomes like a starry sky, and it brings in these forces, nourishment, what they call the nectar of the gods, the ambrosia and the nectar of the gods, comes to the pituitary gland, creates pituitrin, and then pituitrin, excreted from the pituitary gland, goes back into the body and nourishes the nerves and the blood system, particularly the heart. It goes directly to the heart when this happens. So that is the cosmic and earthly nutrition stream that starts in the heart. In the future, we'll just have the heart. We won't have to go through this whole complicated process. But right now, we have, because we believe in time, the head is the past, the heart is the present, and the metabolic system is the future. But when you connect them, there is no time. And you can become that being through your consciousness. So that's what I wanted to say about the heart, is that the heart is the seat of consciousness. And we got to thank Ralph Marinelli and John Barnwell for doing the work that they did to get the mechanistic concepts that have limited even the way a doctor would listen to or look at a heart to be flushed down the toilet. They have moved that forward, and it also helped Waldorf education, and it also helped all consciousness. So I want to thank Ralph Marinelli again. I want to thank John Barnwell for coming on with us earlier, and hopefully we'll be able to talk to even other people about this. And if you have questions about this, make sure that you write to us and let us know, leave your comments, or there's a place that you can send messages to us, and we're happy to answer any questions you have. But most of the questions will be answered either in the second volume of the Gospel Sophia or in the new book, The Eternal Ethers, A Theory of Everything. And I believe that they may be advertised on this page if I'm not mistaken, but they would go a little bit further. But some of that content I wanted to share with you today, because I get terribly excited when I talk about the heart, because there is nothing on the earth like the heart. The heart is basically the home of the spirit on the earth.